Okay, so as we approach the 2025 NFL Draft, there is a lot of chatter about the top prospects. This is the time of year where players come out of nowhere and become first-round picks, or it's the time of year where everybody's flaws are on full display and they end up falling. Today, I want to introduce to you and talk about one of the more quote-unquote controversial players in this year's draft class. He was a 5-star phenom coming out of high school, showed moments of absolute brilliance while he was in college, and after having one good season of production, ended up sort of being underwhelming his other 2 years. He is definitely a mixed bag, as some days it looks like he could be the next big thing in the NFL, and other days you don't even notice he's on the field. That guy is Luther Burden. As a Mizzou fan myself, Luther Burden was a guy who was up and down throughout his time in Columbia, and I still can't quite figure him out. Theo East was more consistent this past season, but in today's video, we're going to talk about Luther Burden. We're going to talk about how he became a 5-star recruit to begin with, why he chose to go to Mizzou instead of other schools, his time as a Tiger, and how I think he'll fit in the NFL. We're also going to talk about why his stock is currently dropping, as many scouts believe he will no longer be a first-round pick. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Luther Burden. Okay, so I'm going to be doing plenty of draft videos, and my goal is to actually cover the top 100 rookies between now and by the end of July. This is my favorite series to do on the channel, so be sure to check out the playlist and go down to the link below, and also suggest which draft prospect I should do a feature on next. Okay, so going back in time, Luther actually grew up in a very tough spot. He said, quote, "Being in St. Louis and being in the environment that I come from, well, there isn't anything but death." Yeah, basically, it was just death. So growing up, Luther ended up becoming a big-time athlete and was always trying to find his way out, he said. Anthony Blue was a longtime local recreation football coach, and he coached the Herbert Hoover Eagles. His teams absolutely dominated each and every year, and nobody, I mean nobody, ran against his team, much less scored against him, until Luther Burden did twice. He said, quote, "It set a bomb off in my mind. It was like he was going to be playing for me. I'm getting him." He was at the same time both furious and fascinated. But going back in time, this was always supposed to happen. His dad, Luther Burden Jr., was a star basketball player for the St. Louis Billikens and had a tremendous mid-range jumper, and apparently sort of made the NBA with the Indiana Pacers. He had a 36-point game one time in college, and also averaged 20 points per game for the Billikens during one of his seasons there. Just like father and son, Luther ended up playing basketball as well. Anthony Blue said, quote, "You should pull up this kid's film in basketball. Nobody could stop him from getting to the basket, not a single soul. This boy was one jump shot away from being a one and done and going to the NBA. That's how good he was. We always had him in 2 sports, and he had tremendous hand-eye coordination and good footwork, and that came from playing both sports. So it looked like it was going to be like father and like son, but instead he chose to play football." He said, quote, "It was indescribable how many touchdowns he scored for me from Little League football from the time he was 12. He had over 100. I mean well over 100. Burden had always been a leader for as long as he could remember, as he was apparently very strong-willed, and his family didn't even have a car to get him to practice when he first wanted to play football at 8 years old. His dad said, quote, "Well, it's going to be kind of hard because when I get off work, I'll take you up there." Burden said, "Okay," but then the dad replied with, "That's not the hard part. The hard part's we're going to have to walk back after practice, and you're going to be tired." But Luther insisted it was going to be okay. He started to blow up while he was at Cardinal Ritter High School and became a 5-star recruit after his sophomore season. He caught 48 passes for nearly 1,200 yards and 13 touchdowns that season. By this time, he had offers from the entire nation and was a blue-chip recruit. He decided to close his recruitment early by choosing the Oklahoma Sooners over the Alabama Crimson Tide, Georgia, Mizzou, and Ohio State. But things would change in big ways. The first change would come as he would leave Cardinal Ritter High School and transfer and play for the 9-time Illinois State champions, the East St. Louis Flyers. He wanted to graduate early and enroll with his new team in 2020, and he also wanted to face better competition both in practice and during the season. Flyers had just lost 7 games dating back to 2016 when Burden arrived, and this was a good career move for him. Another guy who was on the team at the time was a player by the name of Dominic Lovett. Both of these guys ended up actually being friends when they were little kids and played sports together growing up. Lovett ended up becoming another huge name out of the area and would eventually go to Mizzou and just currently finished playing 2 years at Georgia, and he's now an NFL draft prospect at the same time as Luther. As I said, Luther had committed to Oklahoma, but then things would back out. He decided to reopen his recruitment and was now down to Georgia, Missouri, and Alabama. Even with the amount of talent that St. Louis had produced in recent years, many saw Burden as a generational talent. I mean, there were plenty of guys like Jamison Williams, Ezekiel Elliott, and also Kevin Coleman Jr. He was absolutely beloved in the area, and there was a ton of pressure for him to stay home and change the course of the Mizzou football program. Eventually, that's exactly what Luther would do, as he said, quote, "It was real hard. I enjoyed Georgia a lot, and I'm happy where I'm at." He said he knew he'd be going to Mizzou when he left campus after his unofficial visit, and he felt like he needed to be there and needed to make a change in his home state. This ended up changing the trajectory of the Mizzou program, as Eli Drinkwitz was sort of just hovering above water and couldn't really get that many huge wins. This was a huge recruiting win for the Tigers, and it sort of changed the course of the program. In his final 2 seasons at East St. Louis, he had over 101 catches for 1,800 yards and 23 touchdowns. He also was an insane punt returner, and every time he touched the ball was a threat to go the distance. Kerry Groves, head coach, said, quote, "I've never seen a high school football player as good as Luther Burden. He looked every bit as good in person as he did on film, and he actually looked a little bit bigger in person. He's in the same league as players from St. Louis, such as Reggie Germany, Jeremy Macklin, and Terry Hawthorne." For the end of his career, he had over 160 catches for nearly 4,000 yards and 54 touchdowns, and became Mizzou's second highest ranked recruit ever behind Dorial Green Beckham. According to 24/7 Sports, he was a 5-star, the #1 receiver, and the 3rd overall player in the class of 2022. So how would Luther end up doing at Mizzou? And would he be able to live up to his hype and become a big-time NFL prospect? Luther was going to have a ton of hype going into the 2022 season for the Tigers, but ultimately he actually didn't do a whole lot. It was sort of a weird year for Mizzou, as they were just sort of average. Luther ended up having a mixed role on the team. As while he did have 6 catches against both Kentucky and Abilene Christian, he never really popped off the page. He did have 2 touchdowns against Vanderbilt and 2 touchdowns against New Mexico State, but it wasn't until the bowl game that he at least showed a little bit more potential. In a loss to Wake Forest, Luther ended up catching a season-high 7 passes. In total, Burden ended up catching 45 passes for 375 yards with 8 total touchdowns, 2 of which would come on the ground. I guess compared to the hype, he was a little bit disappointing, but at the same time, he was just getting his feet wet in college football. I mean, the guy was a freshman. So going into 2023 though, he was now expected to be the top option for the Tigers, and that's exactly what would happen. He had 7 catches for a touchdown in their first game against South Dakota, and then 8 catches for his first career 100-yard receiving game against Middle Tennessee. They barely won that game, and some were worried that Mizzou would have another bad year. Nope, they ended up blowing up, as Luther then had the best 4-game stretch of his college career. Against number 15 Kansas State, he ended up catching 7 passes for 114 yards and 2 crucial touchdowns. In a home game in St. Louis against Memphis, he caught 10 passes for 177 yards and a big win there. Then over the next 2 weeks, he caught 11 catches for 140 yards and 2 touchdowns in a road victory over Vanderbilt, and then 11 catches for 149 yards against LSU. Sadly, the Tigers would blow that game in the last 5 minutes and get their first loss of the season. But they'd end up bouncing back, as Luther would then lead them to wins against Kentucky and South Carolina before a huge showdown with Georgia for a winner-take-all in the SEC East. Ultimately, Mizzou had an opportunity in that one, but after a costly interception in the second half by Cook, they ended up losing. Burden had a touchdown against both them and the Gamecocks, and then would follow that up with a touchdown against Tennessee as they throttled the number 13 ranked Volunteers 36-7. To close out the year, Burden had a couple of important moments, as on nearly 4th down and forever against Florida, Burden caught a pass on 4th down which led to a Harrison Mevis game-winning field goal, and then he had 6 catches against Arkansas in the Battle Line rivalry game. His regular season was incredible, but Mizzou had missed out on the playoff. If the 12-team playoff had happened in 2024, he would have played in it. They would end up getting matched up against Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl, and in that game, offense was hard to come by, but Burden ultimately had a big touchdown against the Buckeyes, and they would win 14-3. In total, Luther caught 86 passes for 1,200 yards and 9 total touchdowns. This was the breakout season everybody had been waiting for, and going into 2025, he had some legitimate Heisman hype and was considered a top 5 to top 10 draft prospect. Luther was the can't-miss receiver prospect and arguably the top receiver in the country behind Travis Hunter in most people's eyes, but his 2024 season would not go according to plan. He did have an early touchdown against Murray State, but only had 1 performance of over 100 yards, and that came in week 3 in a win over number 24 Boston College. He caught 6 passes for 117 yards and a score in that one. He also had 2 touchdowns and a lucky win at home against Vanderbilt, and then for the rest of the year, didn't do a whole lot. He did have 91 yards and a touchdown against Mississippi State, but he was definitely sort of a second or third option on the team, it felt like. His potential and skill set was not being utilized, and Theo Weiss became the number 1 option for the Tigers. Mizzou's offense was sort of on and off, Brady Cook was dealing with injuries, and things just weren't really connecting. In his final game against Arkansas, he ended up catching 1 total pass, and then he decided to declare for the 2025 NFL Draft. In total this past season, he had 61 catches for 676 yards and 8 total touchdowns. As I said, this was pretty disappointing. Some are now speculating that he had both an injury and an illness going on, but still, this was interesting. Burden then said, quote, "I feel like this is the best time to enter the draft, and I'm confident in myself and what I can do at the next level, and I'm ready for the next step." Okay, obviously he was never going to stick around, but he didn't exactly have the greatest 2024 season. In total in his 3 years at Mizzou, he had 192 catches for 2,300 yards and 21 touchdowns in 38 total games played. So what do NFL scouts think of him? Well, one said, quote, "He's an explosive slot wide receiver who can create first downs and touchdowns out of nothing. He has a good frame and is a weapon on manufactured and underneath touches. He can also win deep because of his very good speed and hand-eye coordination." Some also call him a jack-of-all-trades receiver, but others believe he's one of the toughest evaluations they've ever done. And that's because of his inconsistencies. He was subbing in and out of lineups on film, was banged up from time to time, Brady Cook ended up missing a couple of games, and he also didn't line up in the slot as much as he used to in 2023. You also have to realize that most teams are putting their best guy on him every week, and were doing anything they could to keep the ball out of his hand. So what's really the truth then? That I can't really tell you. Burden is one of the more controversial prospects in this year's draft class because of all this. He has some very high highs and some very low lows, and let's take Mel Kiper's word for it. He said, quote, "Luther Burden is a wide receiver going into this year who was supposed to be the guy. He was the guy that people couldn't handle, so you expected this year for an improvement and basically for him to become a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. That didn't happen, and he was quiet for a lot of those games. Now, after speaking to scouts and GMs, he is not guaranteed to be picked in the first round." So this guy went from someone who was supposed to go in the top 10 and arguably the number 1 overall pure receiver prospect to now not even being in the first round. I don't really know what's going to happen. He has way too much talent and potential for teams to pass on him, and in my opinion, his floor isn't all that low, and his ceiling is extremely high. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. What do you guys think? If you're an NFL fan, what do you think of Luther Burden, and what the heck went wrong this past season? Also, be sure to let me know which prospect or rookie I should cover next. Check out my playlist down below, and all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.